Big news. The long-buried truth about the third party who kept your soulmate away from you has finally surfaced. My beloved child. Something has finally surfaced about the third party who kept your soulmate away from you, and the most disturbing part is that the truth was hidden far longer than anyone realized. For months, perhaps even longer, you may have wondered why your soulmate seemed to pull away at the exact moments when the connection between you was becoming stronger. One day, they seemed emotionally close. Then suddenly, silence. Distance. Confusion. It looked like indecision from the outside, but behind closed doors, another influence was quietly shaping what your soulmate believed about you. And now, one small detail has exposed the first crack in that carefully protected story. Your soulmate recently discovered that something they had been told about you simply wasn't true. But that wasn't the real shock. The real shock was realizing who had made sure they believed it. The third party had understood something very early. Keeping your soulmate away from you didn't require a dramatic confrontation. It only required doubt. A carefully timed question here. A misleading suggestion there. A conversation presented as concern when it was actually designed to create hesitation. Your soulmate didn't recognize the pattern because each moment seemed harmless on its own. But recently, those separate moments began connecting like pieces of a puzzle. A remembered conversation suddenly contradicted something the third party had said later. A detail that once seemed insignificant no longer made sense. And then your soulmate started asking questions they had avoided before. Why had this person always become uncomfortable whenever your name came up? Why had they repeatedly encouraged distance precisely when your soulmate was considering reaching toward you? Don't skip, because what your soulmate uncovered next changed this from suspicion into something far more serious. There was one conversation the third party apparently never expected your soulmate to revisit. At the time, your soulmate had accepted what they heard without questioning it. But now, looking back with clearer eyes, they remembered the strange wording, the unnecessary urgency, and one specific claim about you that could finally be checked. So they checked it. Quietly. They didn't confront anyone. They didn't announce what they were doing. They simply followed the detail back to its source, and discovered that the story had been altered somewhere along the way. That realization hit harder than anger because it forced your soulmate to reconsider every decision they had made afterward. How much distance between you had been created by their own fear, and how much had been deliberately encouraged by someone else. But there is another reason this truth is surfacing now. Your soulmate found something connected to the third party's real motive, and once you understand what they were afraid of losing, everything that happened between you will suddenly look different. What your soulmate discovered next was not jealousy in the simple way they had always assumed, it was fear of losing influence. The third party had grown comfortable being the person your soulmate turned to whenever confusion entered their life. They were the trusted voice. The person who supposedly understood everything. But your connection threatened that position because whenever your soulmate felt emotionally close to you, something changed inside them. They became more independent. They questioned old advice. They started imagining choices that didn't require anyone else's approval. And the third party noticed. That was why your name seemed to trigger strange reactions long before your soulmate understood what was happening. Stay till the end, because one forgotten conversation is now revealing exactly how carefully that influence may have been maintained, and your soulmate remembers a sentence they can no longer ignore. That sentence had sounded innocent at the time: just be careful before you trust what you're feeling. Your soulmate thought it was protective advice, but now they remember what happened immediately afterward. Every time they considered contacting you, the third party introduced another reason to wait. When your soulmate remembered something beautiful about you, they were reminded of an old misunderstanding. When they questioned whether separating from you had been a mistake, another doubt conveniently appeared. Nothing was forceful enough to expose the pattern. That was what made it effective. But recently, your soulmate compared those warnings with what they had personally experienced with you, and the stories stopped matching. They began realizing that some of their strongest fears about you weren't created by anything you actually did. Those fears had been repeated until they simply felt true. And once your soulmate recognized that, they quietly began testing everything else they had been told. Then came the discovery the third party never expected. Your soulmate remembered a specific detail about the period when the distance between you first became serious, and they went back through an old exchange in their mind. Suddenly, the timeline didn't fit. The third party had claimed to know something before they realistically could have known it. That single inconsistency opened a much bigger question: where had the information actually come from, and why had it been presented in a way that made you look impossible to trust? Your soulmate hasn't revealed everything they now suspect. In fact, they have become unusually quiet around the third party, almost as though they're waiting to see what that person says next. Because something huge is waiting for you, the third party has already noticed this change in your soulmate, and what they did after realizing they were losing control may expose the one secret they worked hardest to bury. The third party felt the change before your soulmate ever said a word. Suddenly, the usual questions weren't being answered. The familiar advice wasn't being requested. And whenever your name appeared in conversation, your soulmate no longer reacted with uncertainty, they became quiet and observant. That silence frightened the third party more than an argument would have, because it suggested your soulmate was finally thinking independently. So the third party made a mistake. They brought you up without being asked and repeated an old warning almost word for word. But this time, your soulmate remembered hearing a completely different version of that same story months earlier. One detail had changed. Then another. Your soulmate didn't challenge them immediately. Instead, they asked one calm question: who actually told you that? And for the first time, the third party couldn't produce a clear answer. What happened afterward made the suspicion even stronger. Rather than answering directly, the third party became defensive and tried shifting the conversation toward everything that supposedly could go wrong if your soulmate reopened communication with you. But your soulmate wasn't listening the same way anymore. They were watching. Listening for contradictions. Remembering dates, conversations, and moments when they had almost reached out to you before suddenly changing their mind. Then something painful became obvious. Some of those decisions had happened immediately after private conversations with this same person. Your soulmate began wondering how different everything might have been if they had trusted their own feelings instead of someone else's interpretation of them. Yet beneath that regret came something stronger, a determination to uncover the complete truth. Because now your soulmate understood that confronting the third party too soon could cause the most important evidence to disappear. So your soulmate did something unexpected. They acted as though nothing had changed. They allowed the third party to believe their influence was still working while quietly revisiting the past for themselves. And that's when another forgotten detail surfaced, one connected directly to the moment your relationship began falling apart. There had been information supposedly coming from you, something your soulmate had accepted because it sounded believable at the time. But now they were questioning whether those words had ever truly come from you at all. The possibility shook them. If that message had been twisted, exaggerated, or passed through someone with another motive, then the separation between you wasn't built on the truth your soulmate believed. And there is one person who may know exactly what happened, because your soulmate has just remembered who was present when that information first appeared, and it wasn't only the third party. That second person changes everything, because your soulmate had almost erased them from the memory of what happened. They weren't deeply involved in your relationship, and that was exactly why their presence had seemed unimportant. But now your soulmate remembers something strange. When the damaging information about you first surfaced, this person looked uncomfortable. They didn't agree with the third party. They didn't defend the story either. They simply became quiet, almost as if they knew there was more being said than what was actually true. Your soulmate remembers catching their expression for only a second, a hesitation, followed by a quick change of subject. At the time, it meant nothing. Now it feels like a warning that was missed. And suddenly your soulmate has one urgent question: if this person knew the story had been altered, why did they remain silent for so long? The answer may be closer than anyone expected. Your soulmate recently crossed paths with this person again, and the conversation started casually until your name came up. Immediately, the atmosphere changed. There was an awkward pause, then a sentence your soulmate wasn't prepared to hear: "There was something I wanted to tell you back then." Those words stopped everything. Your soulmate didn't interrupt. They simply waited. The person admitted that the third party had been extremely concerned about your connection becoming serious and had repeatedly asked questions about what your soulmate planned to do with you. But then came the detail that made your soulmate's stomach drop. According to this person, the third party wasn't merely reacting to information about you. They had been actively trying to find information that could be presented in the worst possible way. Suddenly, years of confusion began taking on a completely different shape. But the witness still hasn't revealed the most important part. They admitted there was one particular conversation they overheard shortly before your soulmate pulled away from you, a conversation involving the third party and someone your soulmate trusted deeply. Your name was mentioned several times. So was your soulmate's growing attachment to you. And according to the witness, the third party said something that exposed exactly what they feared would happen if your soulmate chose you. Your soulmate asked them to repeat the words exactly, but the person hesitated, almost as though saying them aloud would reopen something everyone had tried to bury. Don't skip, because this is where the old story begins collapsing completely. The witness finally agreed to explain what they heard. And the first sentence out of their mouth revealed that keeping you apart may have been planned much earlier than your soulmate ever imagined. The witness finally repeated the sentence, and your soulmate felt the entire past shift beneath their feet. If those two get close enough to talk without anyone interfering, we won't be able to change their minds anymore. It wasn't a confession of some elaborate scheme, but it revealed something your soulmate could no longer dismiss. The third party had been worried about direct communication between you long before the separation became permanent. Suddenly, your soulmate remembered how often private conversations with you had somehow been interrupted, discouraged, or postponed. Plans changed at convenient moments. Misunderstandings were discussed with everyone except you. And whenever your soulmate wanted to ask you directly what had happened, they were persuaded to wait until emotions settled. But emotions never settled, because another troubling detail always appeared. Now your soulmate understood why. Distance had created the perfect environment for assumptions to grow, and somebody had benefited from keeping that distance alive. Then the witness revealed something even more personal. The third party apparently believed that if your soulmate spent enough uninterrupted time with you, they would recognize how much of the negative story didn't match the person standing in front of them. That was the real threat. Not simply romance. Not competition. It was the possibility that your soulmate would stop depending on second-hand information and start trusting their own experience with you. Your soulmate immediately remembered one particular day when they had been ready to contact you and clear everything up. They had even decided what they wanted to say. Yet before they could do it, the third party arrived with another urgent warning about you. Your soulmate backed away. Until now, they had considered that moment unfortunate timing. After hearing the witness, they could no longer believe it was merely coincidence. And one question became impossible to ignore. How had the third party known your soulmate was preparing to reach out? That question led to the first truly unexpected break in the mystery. Your soulmate began retracing who knew about that planned conversation, and the list was incredibly short. Only a few people had been told. One of them was the third party, but there was another person who had known even earlier, someone your soulmate never suspected because this person had always appeared neutral. The witness became visibly uncomfortable when your soulmate mentioned that name. That reaction said almost as much as words could. Your soulmate pressed gently, asking whether the third party had been receiving information from someone else all along. For several seconds, the witness said nothing. Then came the answer, "You need to ask what they were promised in return." Your soulmate wasn't prepared for that. Because this was no longer only about someone trying to keep you away. There may have been a second motive hidden underneath everything, and your soulmate is about to discover what the third party believed they would gain if you disappeared from the picture completely. Your soulmate didn't ask about the promise immediately. Something about the witness's expression told them this was bigger than a simple favor between two people. So they asked a different question: what did the third party think would happen if I stayed away from them? The witness hesitated, then revealed the missing piece. The third party believed your absence would eventually make your soulmate emotionally dependent on the circle already surrounding them. No difficult questions. No outside perspective. No reason to reconsider old loyalties. And the supposedly neutral person had helped by quietly passing along details. When your soulmate missed you, when they considered contacting you, even when they started questioning whether the separation had been a mistake. Every time your soulmate moved emotionally toward you, the third party somehow knew. Now they finally understood why those perfectly timed warnings had appeared again and again. But there was something the third party never calculated. Your soulmate's feelings for you didn't disappear during the distance. They became buried beneath confusion, pride, and unanswered questions. The witness admitted noticing this long ago. Whenever someone mentioned your name unexpectedly, your soulmate's entire expression changed. Whenever another relationship or future possibility was discussed, there was always hesitation. The third party saw it too, and according to the witness, that was when their behavior became more desperate. They stopped merely discouraging contact and began trying to convince your soulmate that you had already moved on emotionally. One particular claim was repeated several times, that you had supposedly said something proving you no longer cared. Your soulmate had carried those alleged words for a long time. But now they asked the witness where that statement actually came from. The answer was chillingly simple: I never heard those words from them. That sentence opened the deepest crack yet. Your soulmate suddenly realized they had never seen the original message, never heard those words directly from you, and never received confirmation from anyone who had actually spoken with you. Everything had traveled through someone else. So instead of confronting the third party, your soulmate made a quiet decision: they would trace that statement back to the beginning. And almost immediately, another contradiction appeared. The date when you supposedly made that statement didn't match the timeline your soulmate remembered. On that exact day, something had happened between you that suggested the complete opposite. Your soulmate remembers it clearly now, a small gesture, easily overlooked then, but impossible to reconcile with what they were later told. Stay with this, because that forgotten gesture may prove the third party's story was false. And when your soulmate finally remembered exactly what you did that day, they realized someone had hidden one crucial piece of information from them. That missing piece was connected to something you had tried to communicate before the distance became impossible to ignore. Your soulmate had remembered the gesture correctly, but there was more attached to it, something they never received. According to the witness, you had made an effort to clear up the misunderstanding directly, and the third party knew about it. That changed everything. Your soulmate had spent all this time believing you simply allowed the connection to disappear without fighting for clarity. Yet now they were hearing that you may have tried to reach through the confusion while someone else was controlling what reached them. The realization wasn't dramatic at first. Your soulmate simply went silent. Then they asked the witness one precise question: are you telling me they knew there was another side to the story? The witness lowered their voice before answering, because the truth was becoming harder to deny. Yes. They knew. Those 3 words forced your soulmate to reconsider nearly every painful assumption they had carried about you. The witness explained that the third party had learned you wanted to clarify what happened, but instead of encouraging a direct conversation, they insisted your soulmate needed space. They made your attempt sound intrusive rather than sincere. Even worse, they suggested that responding would only create more confusion. Your soulmate remembered hearing almost those exact words. At the time, they trusted them. Now they realized the advice had prevented the one conversation that might have exposed everything. But there was still a question the witness couldn't answer: what exactly had you wanted your soulmate to know? Whatever it was, the third party apparently considered it dangerous enough to keep buried. And that meant the missing information wasn't merely emotional, it threatened the entire version of events your soulmate had been given. So your soulmate started searching their own memories for anything they might have overlooked. Then one moment returned with startling clarity. Shortly before everything collapsed, you had said something that seemed strangely unfinished, as though you were trying to explain more but never got the chance. Your soulmate had interpreted your hesitation as uncertainty. Now they wondered whether you had actually been trying to warn them about interference happening around the connection. That possibility led them back to the supposedly neutral person who had been feeding information to the third party. And this time, your soulmate didn't ask gently. They asked one direct question about what happened to the information you tried to send. The reaction was immediate: silence, nervousness, then an admission your soulmate never expected. Something from you had indeed been withheld. But before revealing exactly what it contained, this person said, "You need to understand why they were terrified of you seeing it." And the reason they gave next could expose the real motive behind everything. The reason was painfully simple: what you had tried to send contained details your soulmate could verify for themselves. Not rumors. Not somebody else's interpretation. You had apparently referred to specific conversations, specific moments, and one misunderstanding that could have been cleared up with a single honest exchange. That was exactly what frightened the third party. If your soulmate saw those details and compared them with what they had been told, the contradictions would become obvious. The supposedly neutral person finally admitted they had been pressured to keep your message from becoming the center of attention. They were told your soulmate was too emotional to see it clearly and that waiting would protect everyone involved. But waiting accomplished something very different. It gave the third party enough time to replace your explanation with their own version. And your soulmate now realizes that the silence they once blamed on you may never have been the silence they thought it was. Then your soulmate asked the question everyone had avoided: what was in the message that scared them so much? The answer wasn't some dramatic declaration. It was more dangerous than that because it was believable. You had apparently pointed out that several things being said about you could not all be true at the same time. You wanted your soulmate to speak with you directly before making a permanent decision. And there was one line the witness remembered clearly, not word for word, but well enough to understand its meaning. You had asked your soulmate to trust what they personally knew about you instead of what others were telling them. That request threatened the third party's entire influence. Because if your soulmate had followed it, they might have started questioning everything much sooner. Suddenly, the third party's behavior after that moment made sense: the urgency, the warnings, the pressure to move forward quickly and never reopen the past. But your soulmate still needed to know why someone would work this hard to prevent one honest conversation. That's when the supposedly neutral person finally revealed what they had been promised. It wasn't money. It wasn't some dramatic reward. The third party had promised that once you were permanently out of the picture, certain relationships around your soulmate would return to the way they used to be. Everyone would supposedly feel comfortable again. No loyalties would shift. No uncomfortable truths would have to be confronted. Your soulmate heard that and realized the deepest motive may have been control disguised as stability. But one final detail made them freeze. The neutral person admitted the third party had once said that if your soulmate ever learned what really happened, they would immediately know where to look for proof. And now your soulmate remembers exactly what that proof might be, and it has been sitting unnoticed for a very long time. Your soulmate suddenly remembered an old conversation they had saved without understanding why it might matter. At the time, it seemed ordinary, just a short exchange from the period when everything between you was becoming confusing. But there was one detail buried inside it that now felt impossible to overlook. The third party had mentioned knowing something about you several hours before anyone was supposed to have shared that information with them. Your soulmate read the sequence again in their memory, comparing the timing with everything the witness had revealed. It didn't fit. Unless the third party had been receiving updates much earlier than they admitted. And there was another clue. The wording used in that old conversation was almost identical to the language later used to convince your soulmate not to contact you. Suddenly, what had once looked like separate misunderstandings began forming one unmistakable pattern. Your soulmate didn't feel relief when they recognized it. They felt a strange mixture of regret and determination. Because if the timeline was correct, there had been several opportunities for the truth to reach them, and each opportunity had somehow been redirected. But instead of confronting the third party immediately, your soulmate did something much smarter. They asked the supposedly neutral person to explain one specific date without revealing what they already knew. The response changed halfway through. First, the person claimed they couldn't remember. Then they remembered too much. Details appeared that your soulmate hadn't even mentioned. That was the moment your soulmate realized this person wasn't simply protecting an old mistake, they were still afraid of what might happen if the entire truth surfaced. And when your soulmate quietly asked, "Who told you to keep this from me?" the answer wasn't spoken. Their expression gave it away. But what happened next pushed the mystery somewhere your soulmate never expected. The person finally admitted there was another piece of information, something the third party had believed was gone. A record of a conversation still existed. Not necessarily every word, but enough to establish what was being discussed and when. Your soulmate immediately understood why the third party had seemed increasingly nervous lately. They weren't only losing influence. They may have realized the past could now be checked against something concrete. Don't skip, because your soulmate is no longer asking whether someone interfered. They're asking how far that interference actually went. And before your soulmate could even decide what to do with this discovery, the third party unexpectedly reached out with a message of their own. The timing was almost too perfect. And the first sentence made your soulmate wonder whether the third party already knows the long-buried truth is finally coming out. The message arrived before your soulmate had confronted anyone, and that alone made it unsettling. The third party wrote as though they were simply checking in, but within a few sentences they brought up the past without being asked. They warned your soulmate that old situations can look different when people start rewriting history. That phrase immediately stood out. Your soulmate had never mentioned the witness. Never mentioned the old conversation. Never revealed that they were checking dates and comparing stories. So how did the third party know the past was being questioned? Instead of answering emotionally, your soulmate sent back one calm response. What exactly do you think is being rewritten? Minutes passed. No answer. Then the typing indicator appeared, disappeared, and appeared again. And when the response finally came, it contained a detail your soulmate had deliberately kept secret. That was the moment suspicion became something much harder to dismiss. The third party referred to the missing communication you had tried to send years ago, but your soulmate had never told them they knew about it. They tried to explain quickly, claiming they had only been protecting your soulmate from unnecessary pain. Yet every explanation created another contradiction. First, they said they barely remembered what you had tried to communicate. Then they described why it supposedly shouldn't have been trusted. Your soulmate noticed immediately. How could someone dismiss something they claimed not to remember? So your soulmate stopped arguing and asked the simplest question possible: did you know they wanted to speak to me directly? The third party avoided answering. They talked about intentions, timing, emotions. Everything except yes or no. And sometimes the answer someone refuses to give becomes louder than anything they actually say. Then your soulmate asked one final question: why were you so afraid of us talking without anyone else involved? Silence followed. Longer this time. And in that silence, your soulmate understood something important. The third party's power had always depended on standing between two people who weren't comparing what each had actually said. But now that barrier was collapsing. The third party eventually responded with a sentence meant to defend themselves, yet it exposed something else instead: you don't understand what would have happened if you had chosen them back then. Your soulmate stared at those words. Chosen you? That wasn't about protection anymore. It sounded like the third party had been anticipating a choice all along. And when your soulmate asked what exactly they believed they would have lost if you had been chosen, the third party gave an answer that finally revealed the personal reason they had worked so hard to keep you away. The answer came slowly, almost reluctantly: everything would have changed. Your soulmate read those words twice, because they were expecting an excuse, not an admission of fear. When they asked what everything meant, the third party finally stopped hiding behind warnings about you. They admitted they believed your soulmate would become less available to the people who had always depended on them. Time would shift. Priorities would change. Decisions would no longer be made with the same familiar circle involved. And underneath all those explanations was the truth your soulmate had been approaching for so long: the third party wasn't only afraid of losing a person. They were afraid of losing their position in your soulmate's life. Your connection represented change, and instead of allowing your soulmate to choose that change freely, they had tried to make you look like the danger. But your soulmate noticed something else in the response. The third party kept saying, We were worried. We thought you were moving too quickly. We believed this would end badly. Your soulmate immediately asked, Who is we? That question changed the entire tone. The third party tried to retreat, claiming it was only a figure of speech, but your soulmate had heard enough contradictions to recognize another one. The supposedly neutral person had already admitted passing information. The witness had overheard conversations. Now the third party was accidentally describing decisions as though several people had participated in them. Your soulmate pushed once more, and a name finally surfaced. Not as a direct confession, but through a defensive sentence that connected someone unexpected to the earliest days of the interference. Your soulmate knew this person well. More importantly, this was someone whose opinion they had trusted when deciding to stay away from you. Suddenly, the long-buried truth became much more painful. Your soulmate began remembering conversations with this person that had seemed independent at the time. The same concerns had appeared in slightly different language. The same doubts about you. The same pressure to wait before contacting you. Your soulmate had believed multiple people were reaching the same conclusion, which made those warnings feel credible. Now they were beginning to suspect those opinions may have originated from one source and simply traveled through different voices. That realization changes everything, because it explains why your soulmate once felt surrounded by proof that walking away from you was the safest choice. But there is still one piece missing. Your soulmate asked the third party whether this second trusted person knew the original story about you wasn't completely accurate. The reply came almost immediately, and one accidental sentence revealed who first suggested keeping you and your soulmate from speaking directly. The accidental sentence was simple, but your soulmate immediately caught it. I wasn't the one who first said you two needed distance. For several seconds, your soulmate just stared at those words. They had never accused the third party of being the first person to suggest separation. Yet somehow, the third party was already defending themselves against that exact accusation. Your soulmate asked only one thing, then who was? The response didn't come quickly. When it finally arrived, the third party mentioned the trusted person whose advice your soulmate had once considered completely independent. And suddenly, another memory returned. That person had approached your soulmate before the biggest misunderstanding between you had even happened. They were already warning that your connection was becoming too intense. The timing was impossible to ignore. Someone had apparently been preparing your soulmate to doubt the relationship before there was even a clear reason to doubt it. Your soulmate went back mentally to that early conversation. The trusted person had never openly attacked you. They had been subtler than that. They asked whether your soulmate was certain about you. Whether things were moving too quickly. Whether becoming closer to you might create tension with people already in their life. At the time, those sounded like reasonable questions. But now your soulmate recognized something hidden inside them. The concern wasn't centered on whether you treated your soulmate well. It was centered on what your presence might change. And according to the third party's latest admission, those concerns had been discussed privately before they were ever presented to your soulmate. Two different voices had made the same fear sound like independent wisdom. Your soulmate suddenly understood why they had doubted themselves so deeply. They weren't hearing several separate opinions. They may have been hearing one coordinated fear echoed back from different directions. But then your soulmate noticed something that even the third party hadn't intended to reveal. While trying to shift responsibility onto the trusted person, they mentioned a meeting from long ago, a conversation your soulmate had never known took place. Your name had been discussed there. So had the possibility that your soulmate might choose a future with you despite everyone's objections. And apparently, something was decided after that conversation, because within days, the behavior around your soulmate changed. More questions. More warnings. More pressure to leave the past alone. Your soulmate asked who had been present at that meeting, and the third party suddenly stopped responding. That silence was different from the others. It felt like they had finally reached the one detail nobody wanted exposed. Because your soulmate already recognizes one person who must have been there, and discovering why that person wanted you gone could reveal who was truly behind the entire separation. That person was someone your soulmate never imagined would have a reason to interfere. They had always appeared supportive, calm, almost detached from the tension surrounding you. But once your soulmate placed them inside that private meeting, several forgotten moments suddenly looked different. This person had known when your soulmate planned to see you. They had known when doubts were beginning to fade. And somehow, shortly after those moments, the third party always appeared with another warning. Your soulmate began comparing the pattern carefully, and one realization became impossible to avoid. The third party may have been the loudest voice keeping you away, but they weren't operating with information they discovered alone. Someone close enough to your soulmate to know their private intentions had been quietly feeding that information into the situation. And now your soulmate wanted to know what this hidden participant had been protecting. The answer began emerging through one old conversation your soulmate had almost forgotten. Years ago, this person had said something strange about you. If this becomes serious, things around here won't stay the same. At the time, your soulmate assumed they meant ordinary relationship changes. Now those words carried another meaning. Your presence threatened an arrangement everyone else had grown comfortable with. Your soulmate had been dependable, accessible, and easy to influence through familiar expectations. A deeper connection with you might have changed that. Your soulmate might have started making decisions based on what they wanted instead of what kept everyone else comfortable. And suddenly, the third party's actions made more sense. They hadn't needed everyone to dislike you. They only needed enough people to fear what your relationship represented. Once that fear spread, every misunderstanding involving you became easier to exaggerate, and every attempt you made to repair things became easier to dismiss. But your soulmate has now reached the detail nobody expected them to uncover. The witness remembers what happened immediately after that secret meeting. According to them, the third party left believing your soulmate would soon receive information powerful enough to make them walk away from you voluntarily. Nobody would need to demand a separation. Nobody would have to admit interference. Your soulmate would believe the decision was entirely their own. And shortly afterward, that damaging story about you appeared, the very story your soulmate now knows contained contradictions. That timing has changed the question completely. Your soulmate is no longer wondering whether the third party influenced what happened. They're wondering whether the misunderstanding that separated you was deliberately shaped to produce one specific decision. And there is still one person who knows where that original story came from. Your soulmate has decided to speak to them directly, and what they are about to reveal could finally show how the entire story about you was created. The person your soulmate approached didn't expect the question to be so specific. There was no accusation, no emotional confrontation, just one carefully chosen sentence. Where did you first hear that story about them? Immediately, their confidence changed. They looked away, tried to remember, then gave an answer that contradicted something they had said years earlier. Your soulmate noticed. Back then, this person had claimed the information came from someone who knew you personally. Now they admitted they had never actually spoken to that supposed source. Everything had been passed through another person. Your soulmate asked for the name, and after a long hesitation, the truth finally surfaced. The information had come through the third party. The same person who later acted as though they were merely reacting to concerns that everyone else already shared. That circle had finally closed, and your soulmate could see how one unverified story had been made to look like confirmation from several different directions. But your soulmate wasn't satisfied, because one question still mattered more than all the others: where had the third party gotten the original information? When confronted with that contradiction, the person admitted something even more revealing. They couldn't.